Hello, everyone. Russ of Aquarimax Pets here. Today we have a special guest. Our guest is Dillon Perrin from Animals at Home. Oh, hold on. I've got a little bit of a problem. So many technical issues. I'll be right back. There we go. Hello, everyone. Russ of Aquarimax Pets here. Had a little bit of a technical issue there, but I am back, and we're excited to talk to Dillon Perrin from Animals at Home. I did want to answer a couple of Patreon questions first before we do that. One, Sandy Sizemore asks, also known as Aunt Sandy Skinks, question about mourning geckos. She said a breeder in California stated she separated her mourning gecko morphs to keep the bloodlines pure, and asks, that's crazy, right? And I would say, well, unless this breeder in California is attempting to get to the idea that she wishes to physically maintain the different strains or different clonal lineages separate physically, not genetically, because you don't have to worry about them genetically mixing because they are clonal lineages. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying. That's a little strange to say keep the bloodlines pure because they're not going to be interbreeding. From what I know, the males that occasionally, very rarely show up in mourning geckos are all sterile, and there isn't any intermixing between the clonal lineages. They are all results of hybridization events that occurred some time ago, and there's no way they're going to genetically interact with each other. Droth had a question too. Was saying that the pods that got from me early this year finally had babies, a gem mix of Armadillidium vulgare. And so far, all the babies just look clear or white. When do they start getting their colors and patterns? Okay, well, it's very normal for them to show up white. Just about every isopod that I can think of, or almost all of them, start out white or clear. And then after a few molts, they tend to start getting their colors. One thing about Armadillidium vulgare is they'll often have colors that are quite different from adults quite a way into their juvenile stage, and so you won't necessarily know what they're going to look like until they get quite a bit larger. So you will get colors after just a few molds, but you won't necessarily get their adult colors, if that makes sense. All right, so I think those are the only questions I needed to cover from Patreon. Thank you, as always, patrons, for your questions. And now I'm going to welcome Dillon to the stream. Hey, Dillon, welcome.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to this.
Me too. It was really fun chatting on your channel a couple of months ago, and now I'm honored and excited to welcome you to mine.
Yeah, definitely happy to be here. It's always different sitting on the opposite side of the interview conversation, so it's kind of a weight off my shoulders in some way.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a little bit of a different format since your interviews are recorded, pre-recorded, and then edited, and this one's just sort of live off the cuff there.
Whatever happens, happens.
Yep, that's the way it goes. So I see that we have Domestic Dinos, Young Lad, Austin, Jake, 503, Ruben, and Laura Taylor all in the chat so far. I realized my technical difficulty was that I had accidentally marked this as unlisted, and that's why there weren't a bunch of people waiting as soon as I turned it on, so I had to switch it back over to public, and now we're starting to get people to come in. So it won't take long. Generally, after a couple minutes, we'll get some more people. And Cora Works, thank you for reminding everybody to hit the like button. That does help other people see it. So the more likes we get, the faster we're going to have other people show up, and we'll be able to enjoy the live. So Dillon, I wanted to start out with just asking you a little bit about your origin story in the reptile hobby.
Sure. Well, I think it's probably pretty similar to most. I mean, I've always been an animal lover from the beginning of my life. I can't remember a time where I wasn't obsessed with animals. If you asked me what I wanted to do for a career when I was a kid, I would have said scientist. And as far as I was concerned, a scientist meant someone who got to work and play with animals. Um, and I grew up in the country on a farm, so we had all sorts of, small. I actually had an in-ground pool, so we had constantly frogs jumping into the pool and things like that. So I got to interact with mice and moles and things. And even though I live in Manitoba, Canada, which is a pretty cold and winterous type place, we still have a decent amount of amphibians and reptiles, lots of species of frogs, like I said, and also garter snakes. And really, garter snakes are our main snake. There's Western hognose are also here, but I've never seen one. So my childhood was definitely surrounded by catching wild caught things and keeping them for a few days and releasing them again. And so that was always kind of part of my life. But I did not get into keeping reptiles until much later. I think I want to say 16. It was 2007. And I still remember this. I was in Safeway, a grocery store, and I was checking out, buying a couple of things. And at the checkout, there was these impulse purchase Venus flytraps. So I'm like, I'm going to buy one of these. And I took it home and I started doing all this research. And Manitoba is very humid in the summer, which is great for these plants. But also in the winter, we're extremely dry because it's so cold. Everybody has their heat on. So I realized quickly that it was the fall time. So I was going to have to build a terrarium. And so I started kind of going through this process of learning how to build a vivarium and and this is like 2007. So YouTube wasn't really a thing. And I think I remember watching eHow, if anyone remembers eHow.com.
Oh, yeah.
Not the best tutorial. Some of them maybe are okay. And anyway, this one was decent. And at the end of the video, he said, now that you've set up your vivarium, you could consider adding a small reptile like a gecko. And that kind of flicked my switch on again to think, oh yeah, I know it's been a long time since I've thought about keeping reptiles. And that's how I initially got into it. So soon after I got my first crested gecko, and that was pretty early in the crested gecko days, but I wanted to originally get a green anole, but it was impossible to find, surprisingly, despite how common they are. And so I went with the crested gecko, and that's how I originally got into keeping. And that was in 2007. So quite a few years back now.
Yeah, very cool. And this is something that I love about what you do, and you've talked about it on your channel, and it's kind of connected to your mission, if you want to call it that, is that you make sure to keep your collection pretty limited so that you can focus time, energy, and so on with each of your creatures. So with that in mind, which animals do you currently keep, and what was your process in choosing those specific animals?
Well, I got this crested gecko, and then I think it was like 7 or 8 years later, I got a day gecko. So it was a big chunk of time between us. So I don't even really consider myself part of the reptile hobby during those first 6 or 7 years or whatever it was, because I just had this gecko. And so then I got the day gecko, and then I had built this vivarium out of a china cabinet, and it was just really cool. It had some live plants, and I ran into the same issue that I ran into with the green anoles. Is I had this obsession with giant day geckos, but I couldn't find them anywhere because, again, I kind of live in a rural area, and it's a little bit harder to find things in Canada. And so I was stuck with this nice viv without an animal, and so I started posting on forums like, what species might fit in here, and a couple people started recommending snakes. At the time, I didn't even like snakes. I wasn't scared of them, but I wasn't interested in keeping them for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, that experience started opening me up to the world of boas, and I became very fixated on boas. So it was pretty short time from just having my crested gecko to the 8-year gap, and then I got my giant day gecko and a couple of boas. So I have 2 boa imperators and then a Brazilian rainbow boa. So that I was actually kind of starting to go into a little bit of that snowball effect, and I eventually caught myself, and maybe later we can talk about that when we talk about the podcast, how, as you said, keeping the collection quite small. But those first few animals, I don't even know if there was really much of a rhyme or a reason besides I just found the way like a Colombian boa looks or a Central American boa looks just to be incredibly beautiful. I don't know what it was. It took me a long time to even find other species of snakes interesting. I didn't find colubrids interesting at all. And now I do. I keep some colubrids, but at the time I just, for whatever reason, it was that pattern and just the shape of their body, and they're so docile and slow moving, and it's really a perfect place to start for me. And I just found them so fascinating. And so that was why I got into those ones. And now things have slightly changed about the way I may not have done that. The knowledge that I have now, I might not have got boas because they are quite large. Luckily, one of them's, a dwarf boa, so he's pretty small, but my 2 females are going to be pretty large. And as I start to learn more about keeping, you start to realize space restrictions and even the challenges of keeping a tropical species in a place where the humidity drops to 8% in my reptile room, things like that I may have changed had I had a foundation of knowledge to begin with. But I don't know if there was a direct path at the beginning. It was more just grabbing what I found interesting, and kind of went from there. And then it slowly refined as I get to where I am today.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So it kind of happened organically, gradually, and it's interesting because the way you mentioned that you weren't initially interested in keeping snakes, and then you were only interested in a specific group of snakes, and then that eventually broadened. And this is similar to the discussion we had with the discussion you had when you were talking about tarantulas in a recent episode.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think anybody who keeps animals has these experiences where you can see an animal and be almost like off put by it in a way. I think I would never want to keep that, whether it's a tarantula or some species of reptile or an amphibian. And then you'll have a lot of times it's pretty simple passive experiences that open your eyes to the beauty of that animal, whether it's maybe a friend of yours keeping it in such a beautiful enclosure, or you see a video of the animal acting in a natural way, or acting out a behavior. And suddenly it totally changes your perspective. And the episode that you're talking, I recently had a chat with Tom Moran of Tom's Big Spiders. And if I rewound the clock 3 or 4 years ago, I would never keep tarantulas. I could never have done it. I mean, I could respect the people that do, but I would be just too afraid and kind of grossed out. And now I've placed an order for a couple of slings. I'm just waiting for them to arrive, and they'll be here probably in the next week or so. And it was a very similar experience, just finding the beauty in nature, and then feeling, I want to interact with that animal a little bit more. And I think that same thing happened with snakes for me.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do agree. I think I've gone through that same thing. There was a time when I probably wouldn't have kept as many spiders as I have, and now have quite a few spiders of different types that I probably would have been uncomfortable with a while ago. And it's interesting watching that progression and becoming more open-minded about it and so on. So yeah,
totally.
You're saying. So you mentioned you had some colubrids as well. What do you have in terms of colubrids?
So I should have said colubrid. I have a Japanese rat snake, a Laphe clemicophora, and he's small. He just hatched in the fall, so he's still a pretty small guy. And then I also have a jungle carpet python, obviously not a colubrid, but that was another species that I have that I didn't mention in the first round. So yeah, and for whatever, it's one, again, your morph and your tastes morph over time, and what you find interesting morphs over time. And I found myself very fascinated with colubrids, and especially, some of the smaller rat snakes I think are, perfect pets, because they eat well and they don't get huge, and they're very engaging, and especially my experience with this rat snake, he's very fast, he's very visual. It's like a totally different experience than my boas, who are more slow and methodical, and they're not going to outrun you anytime soon. You can let them out and they slowly move across the floor, where the rat snake is much quicker, and it's a totally different experience. So it does make you want to kind of broaden what animals you keep, to sort of feel them out, feel how each species does interact with the environment and with you as the keeper.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said. That's, I think, part of the reason why I'm I keep so many different things from so many different taxa, because that happens, and you realize, oh, this is I got to try that. There's a comment from Tobias. Oh, okay. Yeah. Dillon's Tobias's interest in insect and spiders grew from the desire to breed feeder insects. Interesting. Yeah.
And I could totally see that. I mean, and Russ too, you're kind of responsible for people becoming fascinated with isopods in a way that's beyond the little guys scurrying around as a cleanup crew, right? You're talking about creating cultures, and people become fascinated with their culture, where isopods is like a whole other subculture of reptile and amphibian keeping and invert keeping, where people become obsessed with it to the point where it's really mind-blowing how much money people will spend on some isopods. If you rewound the clock 5 years ago, no one would have thought that.
That's true. That's very true. And I've noticed just how the expos changed in the last. I was just at the expo on Saturday, and had a table there, and it's amazing how many tables have isopods now. And another one is jumping spiders. Same thing. Jumping spiders popularity has really exploded in the last few years too. Same kind of thing. That's I think people, as in general, the hobby is realizing the benefits and the fascination that you can get from keeping such small things. And a lot of those people are reptile people that are branching out into inverts.
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's the thing that's dangerous about inverts, especially coming from reptiles, is you realize, oh wow, you could have 100 of them downstairs in my reptile room without any trouble, and they would have lots of space. You just realize how quickly your collection could grow.
Yeah, that's something I have to be careful with. With limited space, I'm at the point where if I'm getting anything, I have to be careful. Oh, do I actually have space for this? Is this going to work out or not? So I have to
exactly
consider that. And some things I just have to set on the shelf, my mental shelf, and say, yeah, maybe someday, not now. There's no way that I can make that work.
Yeah.
Let's see. Ruben had a similar comment about was never interested in gopher snakes, went to California, found one in the wild, and now planning enclosures. Oh, see, planning for 8 years in the future. That's some dedication and to making sure you do it right. So that's awesome.
Yeah,
I'm
that is
assuming
awesome.
There's also some issues like maybe one of your parents doesn't want you to keep snakes and you're waiting until you can move out or something like that. That's what I had to do, basically, after my mom found a snake in the printer. We weren't keeping any more in the house. So
was it a pet that got out?
Yeah, it was a garter snake that I had that got out of its enclosure and made its way into the printer and surprised my mom. So
yeah, that's not going to work.
No. Okay. Yeah. So tempting to have one of everything the more you get into the hobby and learn about species you didn't even know existed. Very true.
Yeah, it's probably the most pervasive part about animal keeping, especially when it comes to reptiles, amphibians, and inverts, because there is so many different things. And this is something I do try to stress on the podcast, and I talk about a lot, is that it's that addiction mindset where you're not actually, like, the excitement of setting a new animal up and going to buy a new species is so exciting. You get so much dopamine rush from that experience that in itself can become addicting. And then everybody notices you get a new animal, you'll have this peak of excitement for a few months afterwards, and then you kind of return back to baseline, and you're satisfied with your room. This is awesome. And then you start looking at other species, and that's an endless game. It'll just go on forever. So you have to implement strategies, especially if you have disposable income. If you're somebody who's maybe still living at home, or you're a kid, it's a little bit easier because you're saving up your allowance. You can only get one animal, or whatever you can afford. But if you're an adult and you don't have a ton of bills, you could go crazy buying things, and especially if you have lots of space. And a lot of people run into trouble with that, right? They have collections that outgrow them, and then it becomes work and it's no longer a passion. And so you have to be careful of that.
Right. And then you get burnout, and that can be a big issue. It's true.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, that's one thing I love about what you tend to bring out with your channel. This idea that you're promoting a higher standard of care for reptiles or whatever you're keeping. And part of that has to do with making sure that you limit your collection, and that instead of getting into this dopamine cycle by getting new stuff, you can help to satisfy that by improving the situation for the creatures that you have.
Yeah.
I love that. And can you tell us a little bit more about that, how you got started with that philosophy?
Yeah, sure. And it sort of kind of came organically as well, where Animals at Home originally started. It was something I was just kind of messing around with on my own. I was doing some DIY enclosures. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. And but I started looking at local classifieds, as everybody does, right? You start looking at what's for sale in your area. And I started noticing how many reptiles were just in such poor condition. And you see these ads, it's like $500 for my bearded dragon that you can see its rib cage. And, people just have an animal, they don't know how to care for it, and they don't want it anymore. So I was seeing a lot of unwanted animals. And so that sort of disturbed me. So that originally, that was, the first mark in the sand where I thought, okay, there's clearly a miscommunication with as far as just basic husbandry. These people are buying animals from a pet store, they're getting it as a birthday gift, and they clearly don't have the deep obsession that many of us would have with the animal, because it becomes an impulse purchase that they don't care about anymore. So so that I marked as like a husbandry issue. We're not educating these customers enough. And if you did educate some of those customers enough, they probably would decide they wouldn't want the animal once they realize how much work it is. Or they might decide, okay, no, that's great. I'm happy to do all that work and I want to do this. So that's one thing. So that set me on the path of trying to just do better with my own care, trying to work towards the natural environment and trying to replicate nature as much as possible. And of course, there's always people that say, well, you don't want to replicate everything in nature. You're going to put predators in there. Like I get that quite often, yeah, I'm not going to put parasites and predators in there, but I also want to provide the animal with an environment that is similar to what it had evolved to exist in and to utilize. So whatever that is. But the thing is, it's almost like a self-defeating philosophy, because if you go down that path super far, you eventually get to the wild, and you run into the ethical issue of even keeping the animal in captivity at all, because you think, okay, I'm trying to replicate the Amazon rainforest. What are the temperatures? What's the humidity? What plants do they have? What does it look like? And then you're looking at your animal in a box, and you're going, what the hell is this? Is this something like, should I be doing this, or should this animal just be in the wild? So then I sort of started realizing, okay, maybe there needs to be some kind of ethic or some direction to head in with the hobby, or else it feels very, I don't know, it can feel very like we're just taking advantage of the animals and we're not respecting them. Even if you do an amazing job caring for them, you still do have an animal that at some point in its lineage lost its freedom. And so we want to take into account for that. Yes, if you create an amazing environment, it's predator free, parasite free, it's going to live longer in captivity, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't provide a high level of care and you aren't providing an opportunity for it to get a longer life, then it's almost a waste in a way. So then the third thing that kind of really sealed the deal for me is I decided, okay, I have these animals that are already in captivity. They're obviously not being released back into the wild. So the best I can do for them is just increase their care to a high level and be satisfied with that. But I should also do something to protect the animals that are still in the wild. So the animals that are in the rainforest, what can I do to make sure that, I'm is protecting that part of the world as well? So that's why I reached out to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy, which is a charity in Canada, and they have sections of the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. So there's conserving the land there, and so that's why the podcast makes donations to that on usually a quarterly basis, just based off YouTube revenue and the shirt sales and whatnot. But my experience with that was when I first reached out to them and said, I'm a reptile podcast, I'm a herpetoculture, talking about captive reptiles, I would love to donate to your charity. They said no. They actually didn't want me to. It's not that they were saying no to the money, they were saying no to the public donation. They didn't want someone who keeps reptiles to be publicly donating to a conservation, because to them those two things are completely at odds.
Right.
And so that's when I realized that's what the non-reptile keepers think of reptile keepers. They see us as more of a almost parasitic to the natural world in a way. So, which is not true, but it does look that way if we aren't doing our best on our side. So anyway, I had a bunch of conversations with them and made them realize that, hey, there's a whole bunch of people that love reptiles, love snakes, love nature, and they would be so willing to help support you guys. We just have to, build that bridge. And so we ended up doing that. Now we've raised a bunch of money for them, which has been fantastic. But that was the kind of the origin stories for me, realizing that maybe herpetoculture needs some sort of guiding philosophy. Not that I can create a guiding philosophy, but at least I can talk about some of the areas that I think we're weak in, and some areas that I think we can do better in, and some areas that we're already doing really well in. Like we do great with outreach and community. So many people do, birthday parties and things like that, helping people realize these animals they don't need to have their heads cut off or whatever.
Right.
So anyway, so that was kind of, the path I was building.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, and it is making a difference. I see, a lot of people have referenced your podcast. I think I first discovered you through Tarantula Collective, I want to say.
Okay, that makes sense.
When that's when it was. Yeah, that was the first time I heard about you, because he interviewed you for his Exotic Pet Collective podcast, and I thought, oh wow, this guy has some really cool things going on, and I love that. I think it's been spreading, and people are thinking about it more. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you on, because I think some people obviously here are already fans of yours, but there are people who will see this who didn't know about you and didn't know about what you're doing, and how, the philosophy that needs to, be spread around. People need to get more into this mindset of it's it's less about the collector syndrome, and it's more about how can we provide better husbandry? How can we figure out not just better husbandry, although that's a big part of it, but how can we better the hobby in general and better attitudes people have, whether they're in or outside of the hobby?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say we want outsiders, people who don't keep the weird animals that we keep, to look at us and go, oh, they are of value to society. And that sounds like such a grandiose thing, but it's not. I mean, you look at like Little League baseball, no one's gonna be like, oh, those guys aren't doing a service. People, that's a part of the community that people appreciate. And we want our community to people to go, oh, those are people who are passionate about animals. They are passionate about education. They actually are interested in conservation and preservation. And they, if you talk to them, they sound like scientists because they are using Latin names and they understand breeding and all these things. And they're also breeding animals in captivity that, you know, universities and zoos haven't been able to do yet. So we want that to be the experience that an outsider has when they look at us. They may never appreciate snakes and spiders and lizards, but they should be able to look at us more like almost like a high quality zoo in a way, just in general, rather than, you know, the creepy guy with 30 snakes in his basement in drawers that nobody knows who he is or what he's doing with those snakes. And, you know, one gets out and that's the end of it.
Right. Exactly. And that's something that I found really rewarding about outreach programs. There's always someone, and often more than one person, comes away saying, well, when I started this, when you started bringing out creatures, I was disgusted. And now I'm not so disgusted. I'm kind of fascinated. And I have more respect for these creatures, and I have more respect for people who keep them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because people just come to their own conclusions. And if they already don't like the animal, they're just going to assume that the person's weird.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But you get that one who's shaking at the beginning in the back because they see you're taking out a reptile. And by the end, they said, I touched that and I was okay with it. And now I feel better about it. And now I'm kind of fascinated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The Green Jedi Monkey was mentioning your hermit crab episode was really fascinating. Totally agree.
Yeah, that one was one that just blew up. I was kind of surprised by, you know, it's mainly a reptile podcast, but the second most popular episode on the entire podcast is an episode about crabs. But yeah, people love that episode.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I think I was one of those people who was trying to keep hermit crabs, you know, back in, when did I start? I want to say it was either the 80s or early 90s, probably the 80s, the first time I tried. And then I tried a couple times later after that and came to the conclusion that, you know what? Husbandry is not where it needs to be right now. The knowledge is not out there. I'm quitting. And I haven't started back up, even though now there are people who are actually breeding them.
Yeah.
And I think that would be fascinating to do at some point, but I'm not there yet, just because, you know, I have to make decisions about what I keep and whatnot. I would want to do it very intentionally, but I don't think I would want to keep hermit crabs unless I were captive breeding them.
Yeah, and honestly, that is just a tremendous amount of work when you listen to those people talk about breeding. Although you have such a knowledge in, you know, aqua systems and aquarium keeping, that maybe you would be able to innovate some things that hasn't happened in that space yet. Because when I listened to Darcy and the other folks at Crab Central Station, it's just like, that is crazy how much work they're like doing, several hours of work every day for months on end to, you know, keep these things alive. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's true, and I do think that some of the things that I've done in the past would help me, you know, ease into that a little bit. And it would be a little bit easier because I do have a lot of aquaculture, I guess, under my belt. But at the same time, I don't think I can diminish the amount of work that they were doing. Hearing them describe what they were doing, it would definitely be a huge project.
Totally, yeah, it is massive, and they're so small. It's just crazy to hear what they're doing.
Yeah, it is crazy, but it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing that we've spread the message that hermit crabs are not disposable souvenir pets. They are creatures that deserve better care, and it is possible to captive breed them. That's where they need to come from.
And no outsider could look at what they're doing and go, oh, those are weird people that are just keeping strange animals. You'd only look at that and go, these are the most dedicated people who understand this species better than anyone I could come up with. And they are obviously passionate about making this work. And that's a positive thing. And, you know, I know they're doing presentations in their schools, like their daughters were, and doing, you know, university projects on it. It's tremendous what you can do with, you know, focusing on something like that.
It really is. It really is. And obviously there's some sort of appeal to hermit crabs because they've been popular in pet stores for decades. but so it appeals to enough people that that's been profitable.
Yeah.
But now we can see that people like this can actually spread how it should be done. I feel like that happened in reptiles to some degree, and is still happening to reptiles a lot before it happened to hermit crabs. But the fact that it is happening with hermit crabs is great. It's spreading.
Yeah.
And with things like beetles and various other invertebrates and so on, that's also spreading, and it's lovely to see. It's the attitude in general. This creature, it doesn't matter how much it costs for me to get it wild caught. It may be 10 times cheaper to get it wild caught, but I can breed it. Therefore, there's an obligation to the hobby to promote that and go more that route.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. Invest a little more. It's going to cost more, but when you see the images of wild caught hermit crab industry, it's pretty bad. And reptiles is not that much better. It's just slightly less volume as far as deaths, because they're not collecting as much. But the wild caught market on all the exotic, quote unquote exotic pets is not an ideal situation. So the more captive breeding, the better.
True. And it's nice to see that captive breeding is so much more popular now with reptiles than it used to be. But we still have a long way to go. You can still walk into a big box store and find wild caught species extremely easily, and that's not where we need to be. But we're getting there.
Yeah.
Little by little. So one question I want to ask you, we kind of addressed this, but just like a little bit more specifically, what aspect of the reptile hobby brings you personally the most satisfaction?
I think setting up enclosures and doing the research for how I'm going to build something is probably I think the way you answer that question is by thinking about at what point in your day when you're interacting with the hobby does time disappear? Mm-hmm. And for me, it's building with my hands and creating things and doing research. That's where you look at the clock and you're like, wow, I've been doing this for 4 hours and I forgot to eat. I haven't looked at my phone, all those, when you're fully engaged in something. And to me, that's when I'm building and setting up enclosures. And I love that. And of course, once you've set up an enclosure, you don't, it's over, although you can still tinker with things and change things along the way. So that's a big part of my hobby. That's probably one of the biggest, pieces of enjoyment that I get. But I also love looking at content animals in their enclosures. There's nothing more satisfying to me than when I walk downstairs and I see an animal that's just basking or just relaxing on a branch, and it's not pacing, it's not glass surfing, it's not trying to get out. You just know that the animal is satisfied in that enclosure. And you can't always stop animals from glass surfing. The boas will do that. I'll let them explore the basement for a couple of hours, and it kind of satisfies their whatever they're they have this exploratory thing that's happening, and then they go back to being content. And it just feels good as a keeper. And I guess because the opposite of when I see an animal that looks like it wants to get out, that causes me so much anxiety and stress. And all you see is the box that they're in, and you think, okay, what could I change to make this better? So when you see a patient animal that's just seemingly, happy to be there, that's the best.
Yeah, 100%. That is definitely a fantastic thing to see. I agree, and I think I know what you mean about when you're in that planning phase. You're developing, you're creating, and you're in the zone.
Yeah,
and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I sometimes have felt like after I get through that phase, like when I built a dart frog enclosure a few years ago, I upgraded my dart frogs to a larger enclosure. And I built it. I really enjoyed the entire process. I made like a video playlist of all the process. Here I'm putting in the background, and here I'm putting in the substrate, and now I'm going to do the plants, and here I'm putting in the frogs, and did all that. Really got a kick out of it. And then after I was done, the frogs were in it. Everything was great. I was like, that enclosure is too small. It's bigger than my last one, but it's too small.
Yeah. You want to go bigger.
Yeah.
You can always go bigger, and it's weird. It's you can have a massive, like I have the closures behind me are such huge upgrades than what I had before, and then sometimes you'll look at them and go, okay, they could use more space at some point in the future.
Yeah, and that's part of the fun, is that as long as you have the space, you can go bigger, and you have the options to even when you get to a size where you feel like, yep, this animal can be comfortable in this size of enclosure for the rest of its life. You can still look, okay, well, what can I do? Can I put in different hides? Can I put hides in different places? Can I hang a hide from the ceiling that it will utilize? You can look at all kinds of things like that. Or this enclosure is not bioactive. is this a good match for this species? And you decide, doing the research, is it going to be for this one? Because I know that bioactive is cool and everything, but there are times, and you've mentioned this on your podcast before, there are times when bioactive isn't the best fit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so being able to think about that and go through the process and decide whether it is, whether it's not, what makes sense. Is it a semi-naturalistic enclosure? What's going to fit for this species in this situation? Figuring that out is just, it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how people kind of fall into that natural fallacy almost, where there's once bioactivity started kind of grabbing hold, and you talk to someone like John Courtney Smith from Arcadia, who's kind of, he wrote a book on bioactivity. So he is responsible for, partly responsible for people really becoming obsessed with that process. But even if you talk to him now, he's like, people are overusing it. People are just throwing 3 isopods into an enclosure and calling it bioactive. And it's not always the best. If you have soil that's saturated with water and there's mold and fungus building up and you're not cleaning the enclosure, it's not ideal. So there is a big spectrum between, like I said, naturalistic enclosure and bioactivity that is perfectly fine for the animal right across that spectrum. But there has to be some cleanliness, and it has to be cared for properly. Just because it's quote unquote bioactive doesn't mean that it's gold standard.
Right. And I think there are people who are attracted by the idea of, oh, these animals are cleaning up, so I don't have to. And there's some, they're missing some things there, because people don't realize, well, that doesn't mean that you don't do any cleaning. It's going to change the way you do cleaning.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's not, doesn't mean there's no maintenance involved at all.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but it looks like a lot of people are agreeing with what you're saying. Like Aunt Sandy's kinks, learning the natural habitat, creating an enclosure to suit. Love that. Tobias too. Constant upgrades.
Yep.
Yep. Fun stuff. One thing that you have mentioned, oh shoot, it left my brain. I had something cool that you had been talking about. I wanted to bring up, but I lost it. But that's okay. It'll probably come back. Yeah, it'll come back. But I do have another question. Whenever I have a guest on my show, I always feel like I learn a lot from that guest, and it doesn't matter if that person's been in the hobby longer than I have, or maybe 2 years. I always learn something, or a lot of things, more likely. What are some of the things that you've learned from guests that you've had on your show?
There's so many things. I mean, because the podcast itself has quite a large scope. Like, we typically stay in herpetoculture, but I bring people on from all sorts of different areas. But I would say lighting is probably a big one. And just how to provide full spectrum light. We've had a couple amazing lighting experts on. Dr. Francis Baines, John Courtney Smith has been on. We've had lots of companies come on and talk about their lighting that they have for that they supply. So lighting has been a huge thing, and I know that for listeners as well, that's been a big thing. Just enrichment in general, how to the concept of enrichment and how to set up an environment so you have an animal that can investigate and use its surroundings in a way that allows it to, challenges its mind and body. That's been huge. Reptile intelligence is another thing that when I started the podcast, I was very mainstream as far as how intelligent I thought reptiles were. I mean, I knew you could target train a crocodile or an alligator, but that was kind of it. And now we're realizing, they are very intelligent and they can learn. And if anyone's listening to or has watched Lori Tarini's channel, she does just this incredible stuff with the snakes, and she's 150 snakes or something like that, and they're all target trained and they follow her, and she does an incredible job documenting everything. So that has been amazing. That's something that I've learned. I've also learned the concept of preservation. I've had a few people on the podcast who are, zeroed in on maybe a genus or, a couple of species and whatnot, who have identified a group of a genus or a group of species who are endangered or, under threat in the world. And they're working with that. And so you can create these models where you're having a captive breeding program that's designed to potentially save the species. And that's not necessarily something that I want to participate in at any point in the near future, just because I don't think I have the resources. But it has been so fun picking those people's brains and understanding how they create these little satellite areas of their facility to to perpetuate a species. And I know a lot of listeners have taken that and run with it. They'll find a species that they're obsessed with, and then they start working with it in this sort of preservation mindset where it's not really conservation, because conservation talks about, conserving them in the wild and making sure they're protected, where preservation is more like, yeah, they're going to lose the land, so we got to make sure that we at least have a captive population so we don't lose them on the face of the earth. We might lose them in the wild, which is a huge shame, but at least we don't lose them in general. And so that's been really fun to highlight as well. And so I'd say those are probably some of the main things that I've learned, but there's so many things. And then you can go into like different species and nuances there, but there's a lot.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I think those were some great highlights that you brought up. I've been fascinated by a lot of the things that you were saying too. And I'm actually going to have Lori Torini on the show pretty soon.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. She's a wealth of information.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoy her channel a lot. She's got some amazing things going on as well. So it sounds like you've sort of already answered this, but I'll put it out there anyway, in case there's something you want to elaborate on. So have guests that you've had on your show broadened your interests in aspects of the hobby? I guess that's related to the last question, but.
I would say yes. I mean, when you talk to somebody who's super passionate about us, we talked about the hermit crabs. Yeah, I almost deleted that email when I read it. And it's not because I was like, oh, I don't like hermit crab. I read it briefly and I thought, I'm not really interested in hermit crabs. I really don't know if the audience is going to be, interested in it. So I was just kind of let that email go. And I'm so glad I didn't. And then, you listen to somebody passionately speak about a species that they keep, and it does totally broaden your scope of what you find interesting. And whether or not you ever would get into keeping those animals is a whole other thing, but you can use that information. You can use information about how somebody keeps monitors to apply that to your snakes. Monitor keepers are usually, not all of them, but a lot of them are very good about enrichment and puzzle feeding and making sure that they are stimulating their animal mentally, because they're a monitor and they have lots of mental energy to expend. And you can use that and put it in with your snakes. Maybe your snakes are slower moving and they don't seem as engaged mentally as a monitor, but you can easily implement those skills that the monitor keepers are using. And so yeah, I think every time you talk to somebody who's passionate, it'll make you go down a rabbit hole. You just got to be careful how you use it. You don't want to go buy a new animal every time you record a podcast with a guest, but you can pick out things that are really helpful. And I think that's what makes the podcast pretty successful, is we don't often specifically highlight a species, and the goal never is to make someone want to go out and get a species, but we can talk about the animals that someone's keeping as a vehicle for better husbandry across the board, or a vehicle for just better herpetoculture across the board. And that's what's just really fun about the show.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. That actually made me think of something that connects the hermit crabs into this idea of transferring knowledge about one taxon or one species you're talking about into another, and being able to apply certain things. When I started getting into isopods, and I guess you could say I'm an early adopter for isopods, that there weren't a lot of people who were into isopods when I started getting into them. The people who were into isopods were dart frog keepers and hermit crab keepers, interestingly.
Oh, interesting.
They were using them bioactively in both situations. And they seem to, that's the only place I could find information about isopod keeping at the time, was in those two hobbies on forums.
That's fascinating
and whatnot. But it was actually going pretty well within the, I think what happened is, from what I understand, what I've been able to trace is that started out with dart frogs. And then somehow someone, I guess, who kept dart frogs and hermit crabs kind of got it over into the hermit crab area. And then from there, it kind of spread everywhere else. But it was rather fascinating, and a great example of how you can take knowledge from, one area of the exotic pet hobby and start to transfer it elsewhere.
Yeah, it's all transferable. I mean, even talking about Lori Torini, she's an incredible trainer with her dogs, and that obviously has translated to being able to train snakes, which you would never think, but it's the same mechanism, the same positive reinforcement. It's very similar, and she had that skill set, and it was just immediately implemented with snakes.
Right. And I think that is it's fantastic. I remember using, I learned about using positive reinforcement to train things a long time ago when probably about 20 something years ago, I was training rats and I was training birds and things like that, and it was working. And at the time, I didn't have very many reptiles. And then I moved to Hawaii where I couldn't keep reptiles and so on. But then I came back and to the mainland and got a job at a zoo and saw, oh, they're using positive reinforcement to train the lizards and to train the tortoises and to train the snakes. I really want to do that. And I still am fascinated by the idea of training garter snakes with the principles of positive reinforcement, just because they are such a visually oriented taxon. They are so food motivated as well. I think they'd be a really good fit. And totally. So I'm really interested in trying that out. You can try it. It's amazing that you can try it with so many different things. I've trained fish with the positive reinforcement, and you can do some amazing things with fish. And I'm not the only one. Many people have done that, but it's amazing what you can do with positive reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to put this comment up. I like this comment. Yeah, it's about intention, and you're changing a mindset, and that's why it can be difficult for others to get. But eventually, some of them do. So I love it.
Yeah, it's so true. It is really about intention, and that goes back to that early days of me looking at the classifieds and Craigslist. Right, you have people that no longer want animals. They got into it with the wrong intention, and they're never going to change it, or most of them aren't going to change it because it's an impulse purchase. They have no interest in looking at natural history or replicating nature, and that's a perfect way to put it. Intention it has to be there in the right spot to begin with.
Right. So let's see. There were a couple others here. I wanted to make sure we got. So when someone like one thing that I admire that you mentioned is your intention is not when you have a podcast like a couple months ago you had the tachydermis, the long-tailed grass lizards that you highlighted, and you had a couple of guests on there. Mike Titulo is one of them.
Yeah. And Armin Kulian, if I'm saying his last name right, from Herptime.
Yes, that was the other one. And when you had them on, I was absolutely fascinated with the idea of long-tailed grass lizards, and I didn't go out and buy any right then. I was able to, though I was fascinated with the idea of keeping them. I thought someday I would like to do that. I know, right now I don't have the facilities to be able to do that right now, but I love the fact you're saying the purpose is not to get everybody to want to go out and grab this species, but it is to increase knowledge about it. And, and then if they can make an informed decision. If they've listened to a podcast for an hour or so and they get a handle on, the basics, and they can know, okay, now I know where to go for more research. If I do want to go into this, they have a basis, which I love. So I think that's the perfect balance, really.
Yeah. Cause you really want to direct the information to the keeper themselves. What can they change? What can they do? And if you're listening to that episode about tachydermis and you're just you're like, this is the species that I've been looking for my entire life. It fits all the bill or checks all the boxes. Then maybe that is a perfect thing for you. And that's great. But even if you're not going to keep them, you can listen to that episode and pick up on lighting and cage design for a smaller species of lizard or even a smaller species of snake. And there's different feeders and whatnot of things that you may have not thought about for smaller species as well. There's just so much you can pull from that type of episode that, you don't have to jump out and run, go get a tachydermis. But if you're called to do it at the end, then you have a good starting point.
Exactly. And that's perfect. It's a starting point. It's a good starting point. Now, one thing that you mentioned in that, interview, as you have in other of your podcasts, is that smaller species, your philosophy about smaller species. Can you just kind of summarize that for us?
Yeah, says the guy with 3 boas behind him. But this is something that I've developed over time. Is I've just realized how important space is, and the being able to provide gradients, whether that's a UV gradient, a heat gradient, a humidity gradient, just different levels of the enclosure in general, being able to force the animal to use its muscles in a way and problem solve in a way, that's very difficult to do if you have a large animal. So quite often with snakes, we use the rule of thumb. It's like the length of the body should be the length of the enclosure. And that's fine, but there's a big difference between a blood python and a rat snake, or like a corn snake, for example. You're talking about an animal that's, I'll use a Canadian term, a thickness of a loonie, which is our dollar coin, or something that's like a giant sausage. When they're coiled up, the amount of volume that each of those snakes takes is a completely different amount of animal. You're talking about an animal. So the little mental exercise I tell people to go through is picture your snake in a coiled position. Now, try to tell me how many times that snake could fit into, if you were just to stack a whole bunch of those snakes coiled up on top of each other and fill the entire enclosure with just the snake, so that, you open the door and just snakes fall out. How many corn snakes would fit in a 6x2? How many blood pythons would fit in a 6x2? It could be like 10 or 20 or 50 times more corn snakes, meaning that corn snake has more opportunities in that enclosure than the blood python. So that really just shows how important space is, how difficult it is to provide a large amount of space for large species. It just is. And smaller species take up less volume, and you can provide just a way more usable space for them. And so that's why I try to push people towards that. So many people want to keep big snakes, big, Burmese reticulated pythons. It's almost impossible to provide what they need in captivity, unless you're keeping outside, in some kind of like dog run or something. So that's kind of my philosophy. I like to promote smaller species. The everyday person can be successful providing them with an adequate environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. And you see that even the big box industry, I guess, has started to see that a little bit. You see that starting to change. We've gone from the focus on so many. Not that there's anything wrong with having bearded dragons and whatnot, but they used to be far more popular, and now you're getting smaller things like crested geckos and leopard geckos have slowly become, some of the first ones that you suggest as a lizard pet, that are a lot smaller and you can handle in a smaller space. They're starting to promote invertebrates as pets more and provide more mainstream resources to keep invertebrates and so on. So it's good to see that is filtering through, and people are starting to think that way a little bit more.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking about, someone was asking me the other day, when you mentioned the gradients, providing a gradient can even be hard sometimes in a small enclosures. And when you have a bigger animal, it's so much more.
It's like almost impossible if you have a smaller enclosure with a large animal. I mean, I guess one of the criticisms my show gets is I talk poorly about racks too often, but I guess maybe I'll just give my quick 2 cents on that with the rack keeping is, I think there's a time and a place for rack keeping. I think raising babies, quarantine, I think brumation would be a great place for a rack. You're trying to create a dark, small environment that can be cooled and temperature controlled. That's fine. But I think when you look at the state of the ball python breeding industry, for example, clearly there's a lack of interest in what the animal needs and more of a focus on production. And I find it strange that they would argue the opposite when it's just so blatantly obvious that it's an industrial setup for breeding. But when you slide open a drawer and you see a ball python coiled in its tub, and it's taking up a third of the tub or even a quarter of the tub, that animal just has nowhere to go. And when you're talking about gradients, the difference between 30 inches forward and 30 inches back is almost nothing. Like there's nothing, you have your heat tape on the back, so it might have a warm spot, but there's no humidity gradient. There's no, actual tactical, that's not the word I'm looking for. Tactile gradient, as far as, if it's climbing up or climbing down or having to climb up a branch or dig. So it just becomes impossible when you have a small environment with a larger snake. You just can't do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love what it's becoming so much more widespread in the hobby, and I think it's partly due to you and other people who have talked about this, is that you have, I know you've done the interviews about like ball pythons, and how some people argue that they're in the wild, they're sitting inside a termite mound or whatever, and that's all they're doing all the time. And so living in a dark little rack is perfectly acceptable. But the point is that that's not what's going on. They spend time in termite mounds, sure, but they're also out hunting, they're climbing, and they have episodes where they go into trees and hunt birds, and they're doing all kinds of things. And we need to be sensitive to that in captivity, and make sure that we provide like these height gradients and thermal gradients and humidity gradients and just different things to do, and that their brains can be deprived when they're young. And if so, they're deprived of development, just as humans are different than snakes. But at the same time, if you put a human into a deprived environment, you put a snake into a deprived environment, you're going to get stunted mental growth as well as other issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, same with dogs or anything with that neuroplasticity. If you remove stimulus early on in life to the point where there's almost no stimulus, then you remove the brain's ability to handle stimulus, and the brains need to be able to handle stimulus. We actually also need to be stressed. I mean, and I don't mean stressed as in the, cortisol levels are to the roof, your hair is going gray. I mean, stress as in the reason someone goes to work out. That's the kind of stress that you want to put on a biological unit.
Right.
People work out because they want to stress their muscles, stress their joints, stress their tendons and their ligaments, and then the body adapts and gets stronger. And that's a crucial part of just life. And, even if an animal spends 95% of its life burrowed, you cannot offset or get rid of the 5% of the time where it's exploring and hunting and problem solving, because that's a crucial part of its life. Ball pythons are relatively low energy snakes. They do a lot of ambush hunting. They're going to be, hunkered down for hours or days or weeks at a time.
Right.
But you need to provide that outlet for it to explore and hunt and move around.
Yeah, I love the way you put that it may only be 5%, but you can't discount the 5%.
Exactly. It's so crucial.
Yeah.
And this is a good point too. I mean, I think a movement that we're seeing now where people are saying, would you pay more for an animal that maybe both the parents were in enriched environments, and maybe the baby was even raised in a more maybe it's a tub but with leaf litter or sticks or something for the animal to investigate. There's a lot of people that say, yeah, I would pay an extra $50 or whatever it is, some arbitrary number, more than an animal that is just plain old rack or wild caught.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I know that some people, and I'm not trying to look down on anybody or whatever, but when I noticed that some people will really try to make sure that even for their baby snakes, the just born, they really try to provide a complex environment for it. And that's what I've tried to do. As soon as I get a batch of baby snakes, I'm making sure, okay, I need to change up the environment frequently, and made sure they have lots of different places to hide and things to climb on and all these sorts of things. And with garter snakes specifically, since you can keep garter snakes communally, both as babies and as adults, they serve as enrichment for each other. They're social enrichment. They're interacting. And people have found that garter snakes raised in isolation without other snakes tend to be jumpier, because they're not having the stimulus of constantly have other snakes. They're jockeying for position under a basking light, or they're trying to fit together into a hide and so on. And doing that makes them more comfortable with the stimulus, the tactile stimulus. So they're a lot more likely to be comfortable when a human needs to handle them. You see that. I had one surprise clutch that was produced for me, just stored sperm clutch of one garter that showed up blast fall, totally not expecting that, because I hadn't had her in with a male or anything. And then just there it is. So for a while I had to keep it by itself, and it was not adapting as well as they were when I kept them in groups. So as soon as I could, I put it in with other snakes, and it's doing better now.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating that all these things that people never would have thought of, but they really do have that capacity for developing this. They start out with the neuroplasticity, and it either gets destroyed or it can be fostered. You can.
Yeah. I mean, and Of course, because it's just that is the prerequisite for surviving in the wild, to have neuroplasticity. You're not just a programmed thing that only has a set of behaviors that you have to be able to respond to environmental stimulus. I mean, that's just what happens. So it's kind of a silly argument when people think that, oh, these are very simple, they don't know how to learn. Of course they know how to learn. Those same people will say you got to be careful when you open the drawer because it'll strike because it thinks it's being fed. Well, that snake has learned that when you slide open the drawer, it's being fed. And then the one next door isn't doing it. This one in particular has learned that, and it's a learned behavior. So we know that they have that capacity.
Right. And if the only stimulus they get is that when the drawer opens, they get fed, then that's how they're going to react. That's what
exactly. Yeah.
That's how their environment has taught them. And here's a good point, that it's not so much that they are tubs that's the problem. If you are giving them very large tubs and they have all kinds of enrichment, then there's nothing wrong with that. There's no difference as far as the corn snake is concerned between a tub and some other enclosure if they have the space and they have the complex environment to interact with. It's still just as beneficial.
Yeah, and I get that all the time. People say, like, they'll send me pictures of their racks of, like, look what I've done after listening to the podcast. I've changed this. I upgraded to larger tub size. I've added this enrichment, and I'm seeing differences. Like, all that is fantastic. The one thing I would love those individuals in the community who are working with racks on a more enriched basis is to implement lighting in some way. And that's obviously not easy. You'd have to have, like, maybe skip every second shelf or something so you have lighting in there. I think there is a lot of evidence to show how important full spectrum light is for pretty much all animals. I think snakes get away with it because they do eat a whole prey, so they're getting a lot of their vitamins and minerals and whatnot through their diet. But there is an importance of light and infrared and UV and visible light as well. And so that's I think would be the next step for people who are really focused on trying to enrich their racks. I would love to start seeing more lighting incorporated, and you are starting to see it now. But I think it's a complicated task because of how tight the rack systems generally are.
Right. But it does seem like that would be advantageous to provide them with a light cycle, especially for any species, but especially species that are very visually oriented and diurnal.
Yeah.
Well, the time flew by. We've already done an hour.
It really did. Hey, 102 already.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure that before we go, I want to cover a couple of things. One, I want to make sure that if you had something else you would like to say, that you have a chance to say it.
I think just if people who are involved in the hobby, whether it's inverts or reptiles and amphibians, just keep looking for ways to improve your care. And I say this from a position where you're not going to be able to do that every day. Maybe like twice a year you can improve your care. It's not something that you need to do continuous, like on a weekly basis, but it's something that you want to continuously do. I think we're never done learning how to care for these animals because it is it's science, it's biology, it's complicated. So stay open-minded. Know that the way you think of how to care for them now might be completely different in 2 or 3 years, but stay on the cutting edge as much as you can. Put away a little bit of money, whether it's adding a UV bulb or adding more space or branches or upgrading the enclosure size or adding a plant or a stick or something for the animal to investigate. Like that you can't understate the value of just adding a thing in the enclosure for the animal to investigate. That is so key. And so that'd be the last thing I would want to say is just stay open-minded and know that progression of care is the best care.
Yeah, that I love that. Progression of care is the best care. And I didn't mention it specifically, but I've had the Instagram. This is your profile Instagram link here that's been scrolling down at the bottom of the screen there. So if you want to check out Dillon's Instagram feed, you can do that there. Of course, you can definitely need to, if you haven't already, check out his YouTube channel, Animals at Home. I really enjoy listening. I've been listening to your the UVB lighting with Zoom Ed. Well, lighting, not just UVB, but there's a focus on that. With Zoom Ed is the one I'm listening to right now, and I really get a kick out of the variety of topics and the just the overall mission that you have of just elevating husbandry in various ways. It's fantastic. So I hope I know that some of the people in the chat said that this is their first time hearing about you. So now you'll have more people that they're saying they're intrigued and they want to to go check out what you have to offer. And I think that's awesome. And hopefully, usually we get a lot of people who watch this after the fact as well. And we'll get some more people to start following you and hear the awesome things that you have to say.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. All the new people, thank you for finding interest at this point. Hopefully you do enjoy the show when you go check it out. And as Russ said, yeah, it's on YouTube, Animals at Home. The show gets posted both on YouTube and any podcasting platform, whether that's Spotify, Apple, whatever else people have for podcasts. And the show itself is part of a larger network, which is the Animals at Home network, which is something that I manage. So if you do subscribe on Spotify or Apple, you'll also see a few other shows that are not hosted by me, but there's a reptile and research podcast and Project Herpetoculture, which are two relatively new podcasts that are kind of under the umbrella of my show. Incredible podcasts as well. So those you could check out. But if you're looking just for my show, you'll find that on the apps as well as YouTube. The video version of the podcast is there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've also checked out Reptiles and Research, and I enjoy that as well. I'll have to check out the other one, Project Herpetoculture. I don't think I've done that yet. So there's my homework right there.
Yeah, there's more to listen. There's always more to listen to.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining, and really appreciate it. I hope we were able to cover, I think I covered the questions here, and you were able to give some parting remarks. So if I'd love to have you on again someday. There's plenty to talk about always. So if you'd be open to that, I'd love to have you on again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was a blast. And thank you very much for having me on and coming on my show as well. So maybe some listeners can go check out that episode if they want another crossover. But I do really appreciate being here today, and definitely we'll do another one in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining.